I just want to talk today about why we need game-changing technologies, and I think there's been some comment about that throughout the day. But from a personal perspective, we're in a carbon battle, and so really we need to answer three questions, which is, why really are we all here? You know, either as investors, innovators, intermediary within the clean tech environment. So I want to just go back to some basics and just reaffirm the reason why we do what we do. And then specifically, why do we need to change the game? There's a lot of incrementalism around today because investors are comfortable with incrementalism. Business plans kind of work well on a 5% improvement in sales, and we really need to think slightly differently when we talk about game-changing innovation. And I just want to talk a little bit about how to make game-changing innovation, and here I feel a bit of a fraud because there's been some excellent speakers today, some great presentations, and people who probably know much more about it than I do. For me, climate change is the moral imperative of our generation. I think Barack Obama probably put it most succinctly in saying that we're the first generation to really feel the effect of climate change, and we are genuinely the last generation who can do something about it. And therefore, we are in a race. We are in a war against the production of carbon. And this really is the graphic that tells it all. From 1880 to 2016, so just over 136 years, this plots the change in temperature across the world. And you can see, obviously, that red is hotter and blue slightly colder. And what we can see is since about 1980, the temperatures have absolutely screamed away from averages. And the bad news is, of the last 17 years of this millennium, we've recorded 16 of the hottest years in the history of mankind. That's quite an edifying picture, if you like, because the cost that carbon has on the planet is quite extraordinary, and I could spend probably about half an hour talking about each of these. I'll just list them down, and it truly is the challenge that we have in the world today, and it is indeed, as the IMF and a number of other international bodies have stated, the number one threat to the global economy. And we shouldn't really forget that. Now, from a moral perspective, the impacts of climate change fall most heavily upon the poorest. And those are people in Bangladesh who in probably the next 25 years will see further inundation of rising sea levels, mass migration. We'll see the impact of droughts, and we've already heard today from Thin Air and others about the lack of water in Northern Africa and the Middle East, and the marginal economies will become even more marginal. And so really we do have a moral obligation as we sit around here as individuals, as a society, to do something about this problem. And where we are today in terms of potential impact of global warming, we talk a lot, and the Paris Climate Accord talks a lot about hitting the 2-degree warming kind of threshold and trying to keep underneath that. The reality is today that that's looking a more and more distant hope and prospect. And as you can see, if we just run flat from today, we're looking at around a 4-degree rise in global temperatures. And indeed, if we have increased consumption and a lack of attention to carbon, to clean tech, those numbers will go higher. And indeed, if we want to stay below 2 degrees, as Chris said, one of the challenges we've got, we actually have to go further than an 80% reduction in carbon, further than 100% reduction in carbon. We have to actually start sequestrating carbon. And that is all part of the technology drive that we, as a civilization, need to be on. And why it's important that we're looking at game-changing technologies and innovation. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this slide or indeed this concept, but this is around the carbon budget. And I'll just say, if you look at the 1,541 circle, that is the number of gigatons of carbon that are estimated to reside in the kind of fossil fuel, be it gas, oil, or coal, in reserves in the ground, of which around half of that, 762 gigatons, are those that are fully identified as accessible reserves today. If we're to stay underneath 2 degrees, we can't take more than a third of those reserves out of the ground if we're going to hit that 2 degree. And indeed, if we're even at 3 degrees, which is way above where any of the Paris Accord has talked, that's only around half of that. And so we need to, over the next 50 years, actually displace a huge amount of fossil fuels that are in the ground and that are budgeted for, frankly, in a lot of the financial markets. And as Chris said the other day, I think we're looking at the end game for fossil fuels here. And here's an example from 2010 of the hard blue bar there is the aggregated US coal sector. And what we've seen over the last 7 years is that the market capitalization of the entire coal sector in the US has dropped by over 95%, with some very large bankruptcies at the same time. And indeed, if we look forward over the next 20 years, what is going to happen in this world is we'll see a similar pattern starting to hit the big oil majors, to hit probably some of the big oil-producing economies in the Middle East. It's no surprise to me that the Saudi Arabian government is trying to float Aramco because it's trying to diversify itself away from carbon from oil. Now, the challenge is these numbers are truly huge. We're looking at stranded assets. So people who've invested today in fossil fuel power stations, in oil fields, you name it, they are looking at a significant risk to the $2 trillion that's invested in that market could just go up literally in smoke. And it's estimated that there's over $22 trillion of revenues that could be impacted heavily over the next 25 years by this mass transition into renewable energy, which is a good thing, but is also a major risk. And indeed, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, recently has said that the challenges currently posed by climate change pale into insignificance compared to what might occur. And indeed, once climate change becomes a defining issue for financial stability, it may already be too late. So the financiers around the room, those who are more enlightened, are actively looking into this space to say we need to find the hedge against this carbon cliff, the hedge against the financial instability that is probably very rarely coming. And we only have to look at some examples here, and this is from Bill Gates, who's actually hit the nail on the head, saying that we can make progress with some of today's tools, some of today's technologies, but we can't get to the target that we've set ourselves of 80% reduction, much less 100. And he's just put $1 billion into his own clean energy research fund. And we're beginning to see, both on an impact basis, but also a corporate venturing basis, and also a venture capital basis, that money is now beginning to trickle more and more into this space after what has frankly been not a great experience in this sector. But I think we're seeing some green shoots and opportunities moving in. And I think as a lot of the presentations today have shown, that there is a huge opportunity to tackle this CO2 issue globally. And this is what we call a marginal abatement cost curve. And I won't go into the technical basis of it here. But what it is telling you on the left-hand side, there are things that really you're getting paid to do if you choose to a low-carbon alternative, versus on the right-hand side, the most expensive things you can doing if you're trying to take carbon out. So there are examples here on the right-hand side. For example, LED lighting. It's actually a no-brainer to make it. It's the one investment you should be doing at home, domestically, or corporately otherwise. Whereas on the right-hand side, you could be looking at, for example, today's technology, some kind of carbon capture on the back of some of the coal-fired power stations and so forth. And I just want you to just take that little red circle with you on LED lighting, because it's really important on the innovation piece, and I'll talk about that later. So when we talk about changing the game on innovation, what does that mean? And clearly we need to think differently. We need to be orthogonal in the way we approach our problems. But actually we can't just think about technology. Innovation comes through a mixture of technology, of business model, and of financial structures. So all around the room today, and as we've seen during the various presentations today, we need to be able to synthesize all of those components to truly make a game-changing innovation. And we've heard today about innovation and technology cost reduction. And this example just says, well, if we look over the last 10 years or so, we've seen some dramatic drops in wind, solar, LED lighting. And clearly that's been driven by investment in R&D and technology. As I mentioned before, if you recall, the cheapest, most obvious thing to do is replace lighting with LED lighting. Now, if we take a look at the UK, today we consume around about 12.5 terawatt hours of electricity just to light our homes, our factories, our schools, etc. Now, that could easily be reduced to 6 terawatt hours, and actually the government's kind of positioned itself in that figure for 2020. It will miss that figure at the moment. But indeed, if we fully changed out LED light bulbs, the saving would be even larger than that. And what I find strange is, for each terawatt hour that we could save per year, that's around 400,000 tons of CO2. So if we could accelerate the switch to LED lighting by 5 years, we could deliver 14 million tons of carbon savings. And actually, that isn't an issue from an economic perspective, because we'd all literally be putting money in our pockets through going over that period. Now, what is that telling us about technology? The technology has been developed. It is telling us that we have not yet got the right business model, the right motivations in place to affect the kinds of change that will be required. So the one thing I'd ask a lot of people in this room today, the amazing companies that are out there, is to stop for a moment and think about the business model that you're pursuing. Because this isn't just a technology game, it's a business model game. And finally, I want to talk a bit about finance. And I obviously work for an investor in the space, but we're going through a massive change in certain parts of the clean tech environment, where we're moving from centralized power stations to decentralized power. We're moving from big, clunky grid networks to localized battery and smart controls. Now, what does that mean for the traditional world of finance? And I was at a dinner a few months ago, and I'm often brought into a dinner because I probably drink a glass of wine too many, and I start to say things that are a little bit controversial. And I was looking around the table, and it was an energy infrastructure dinner, and there were some very established international energy infrastructure bankers. There were some very established private equity investors in large power stations. There were some big city lawyers. There were some government ministers, some government departmental senior individuals around the table. And I was asked to sum up at the end of the dinner, and I just said, what I see here are actually a lot of dinosaurs, because bankers like to see where their security is, and they like to go to their credit committees and say, it's that big power station. I've got security on the land. The private equity investors like to say, I can see the cash flows, and I can actually build a model, and I'm happy with those cash flows. The government minister likes to come to put his his high-vis jacket on, his helmet on, to open that site. When you move to millions of batteries or installations on a distributed power network, you no longer have those players in the game. You no longer have the lawyers who make their money from 1,000-page legal documents, providing security and certainty on some of the legal flows there. And so we, as an industry, have to face that challenge and change. And I think one of the things we need to do collectively is work together to understand what this looks like, what the shape of it is for investment, for business model, and also for technology. Now, personally, I'm very optimistic about our ability to innovate. And I just read a book recently called The Undoing Project, which I'm not sure if any of you read. It's by Michael Lewis. It's about two world-famous Israeli psychologists, Kahneman and Tversky. Indeed, Daniel Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. It is a fascinating book. I don't work for Amazon, but I recommend you get it. And for me, it's great to be at a day like this, because there is optimism. And actually, optimistic people play a huge role in changing the world. And so it's good to be in a place where we can genuinely change the world. Because the challenge we have, and I always like this quote, and I've been using it for a long time, is from Sheikh Yamani, who, as well as having a great name, was a Saudi oil minister in the 70s and early 80s, who said the Stone Age didn't end for a lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil. And the reality is, from the carbon budget we saw before, from the rising temperatures that we've seen before, this has to become a reality. And the only way we can do it is to be the harbingers of the Bronze Age, and that is bringing around technology as opposed to resource. And indeed, one of the professors at MIT recently said that we're moving away from a period where the resource was in the ground to where technology is the resource. And so therefore we should all think today about how we, within the context of Cleantech, Innovate, can be the technology and be the resource. Thank you very much.